Could data shimmer? Dr. Park Ji-min leaned closer to the monitor, her reflection momentarily superimposed over the intricate spectral graphs mapping the atmosphere of Kepler 186f. Yes, it seemed to shimmer, not with light, but with implication. A persistent anomalous absorption line flickered across multiple datasets, a whisper from 500 light-years away that hinted the established models were wrong, or rather, incomplete. And the most established model, the one considered canonical in their department at Seoul National University, belonged to Professor Kim Dae-hyun, her supervising professor. A titan in the field, decades her senior, whose approval was the gate through which her future career must pass. Excitement warred with a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Pushing her glasses back up her nose, a habit born of intense concentration, Ji-min saved the latest analysis run. The evidence felt solid, compelling. But Professor Kim, he did not suffer challenges gladly, especially not from postdocs barely 5 years out of their PhDs. She rehearsed her opening lines mentally, marshalling the logic, the data points, the sheer weight of evidence she hoped would be undeniable. Astrophysics was a realm of elegant mathematics and verifiable observation. Surely, the truth of the data would speak for itself. Professor Kim's office was a fortress of academic achievement. Dark, heavy wood bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with journals dating back decades. Awards glinted softly under the recessed lighting. The air held the faint, layered scent of old paper, stale coffee, and unchallenged authority. He sat behind a large, imposing desk, fingers steepled, regarding Ji-min over the top of his half-moon spectacles. His grey hair was thinning, but meticulously combed, his suit immaculate if slightly dated. "So, Doctor Park," he began, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of impatience, "your urgent request for a meeting. You have found something?" Ji-min took a steadying breath, launching into her presentation. She kept her voice level, professional, focusing on the graphs projected onto the wall screen. "Professor, the analysis of the recent Kepler transit date of 186f shows a consistent absorption signature here," she indicated with the laser pointer, "which isn't accounted for by the standard atmospheric composition model, across 3 separate observation cycles using different filtering algorithms." Professor Kim waved a dismissive hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. The gesture was small but absolute. "Noise, Dr. Park. Instrument drift. We see these artifacts constantly. You are young. You haven't developed the eye for distinguishing signal from interference yet. But, Professor," Ji-min pressed, her voice tightening slightly, "the persistence, the specific wavelength, it matches theoretical predictions for complex organic molecules, far more complex than the model allows for under current assumptions about atmospheric retention." "Assumptions?" Professor Kim's voice sharpened. "Dr. Park, my model is based on decades of established physics. It has been verified countless times. You are suggesting..." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Are you suggesting my foundational work is flawed?" "Not flawed, Professor." Ji-min backtracked hastily, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Perhaps incomplete? The data suggests a parameter space we haven't fully explored." "Nonsense." He sat back, definitive. "The model is robust. Recalibrate your instruments. Check your data reduction pipeline for errors. 이건 무조건 이렇게 해야 돼. 내가 맞다니까. This must be done this way because I'm right." The finality was absolute, a door slamming shut. He picked up a pen, already turning his attention to a manuscript on his desk. The meeting was over. Ji-min stood frozen for a moment, the shimmering data on the screen now feeling dull, impotent against the wall of his certainty. She gathered her tablet, mumbling a polite, "Yes, Professor, thank you for your time," and retreated, the knot in her stomach now a leaden weight. Why couldn't he just look at the data? The frustration simmered for days. Ji-min meticulously reran every analysis, checked every calibration log, even cross-referenced with data from a different telescope array. The signal remained persistent, undeniable, at least to her. She felt trapped between the evidence of her senses and the immovable object of her supervisor's conviction. Sleep became elusive, her small office cell near SNU feeling more like a cage lined with unpublishable graphs. She skipped lunch, fueled by lukewarm instant coffee and growing despair. Her ambition, usually a bright, driving force, felt overshadowed by the looming impossibility of getting Professor Kim to even consider her findings. He represented the gatekeeper not just to publication, but to the very progression of scientific understanding in their specific niche. His refusal felt like a betrayal of the scientific method itself. She decided to try again, arming herself with even more detailed charts, plotting statistical significance levels that were, frankly, astronomical. She caught Professor Kim in the hallway near the department's seminar room, hoping a less formal setting might help. "Professor Kim, excuse me," she began, holding up her tablet. "I've refined the error analysis on the Kepler 186f data. The probability of this signature being random noise is less than 1 in a million." He glanced at the screen, his expression unchanging. "Park, diligence is commendable, but misdirected effort is wasted effort. Have you considered spectral contamination from a background source? Or perhaps flaws in the atmospheric refraction correction?" He didn't wait for an answer, already turning towards his office. "Focus on confirming established principles first. True breakthroughs are rare, especially for those just starting out." He delivered the last part with a look that managed to be both patronizing and dismissive. It wasn't just about the data anymore. It felt personal. He was questioning her competence, her very ability to function as a researcher. The unfairness of it stung, leaving her speechless in the sterile corridor, the hum of the nearby servers mocking her silence. That evening, Jimin met Dr. Choi Soo-yeon at a small bustling cafe in the labyrinthine streets of Hongdae. The cheerful noise and aroma of roasted coffee felt worlds away from the tense quiet of the astrophysics department. Soo-yeon, a few years older and working in a different research group, listened patiently as Jimin poured out her frustrations, the words tumbling out in a rush of anxiety and indignation. "He just won't listen, Soo-yeon. It's like the data doesn't exist if it contradicts his precious model. He implies I'm incompetent, that I can't see what's right in front of me." Soo-yeon stirred her latte slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Professor Kim. He's from a different era, Jimin. His reputation was built on that model decades ago. Sometimes when people have invested their entire identity in something," she trailed off, shrugging slightly, "it's hard for them to see beyond it. Logic doesn't always work when someone's ego is on the line." She took a sip of coffee. She continued, choosing her words carefully. "It's less about proving you're right, and more about understanding why they need to believe they are. Making them feel heard, even when you disagree. It sounds counterintuitive, I know." She didn't offer concrete advice, but her words planted a seed in Jimin's mind. Understanding his perspective, making him feel heard. It felt wrong, almost manipulative, when the data was so clear. But the direct, logical approach had failed spectacularly. Back in her office cell that night, surrounded by the glowing screens displaying Kepler 186f secrets, Jimin felt a shift. The frustration was still there, a bitter taste in her mouth. But Soo-yeon's words echoed. What if arguing the data was the wrong strategy entirely? She started searching online, not for astrophysics papers, but for communication strategies, conflict resolution, dealing with difficult personalities. Article after article, blog post after video seemed to converge on a similar theme. When logic fails, appeal to emotion, to ego, to perspective. She stumbled upon concepts that resonated eerily with her situation. The Dunning-Kruger effect, where lack of knowledge fuels overconfidence. The inherent human need for validation. The futility of direct confrontation against entrenched beliefs. One particular piece outlined specific tactics, make the other person the protagonist of their own story. Ask unexpected questions that reveal gaps in their own thinking. And finally, set clear boundaries while acknowledging their viewpoint. It felt alien, this indirect approach. Her entire training screamed for evidence, for logical deduction. But desperation gnawed at her. Her research, her potential career breakthrough, was stalled by one man's intransigence. She had to try something different. Strategy 1. Make him the protagonist. Could she stomach it? Could she genuinely inquire about his past work, the work she now knew was incomplete, just to make him feel validated? It felt disingenuous, yet what other options did she have? She spent an hour formulating questions, focusing on the challenges he must have overcome decades ago, the ingenuity required with older technology. She practiced them aloud, trying to inject genuine curiosity into her voice, pushing down the resentment. The next opportunity came a few days later. Professor Kim was holding court near the department's perpetually malfunctioning coffee machine, lamenting the lack of rigor in modern research methods to a younger faculty member. Jimin saw her chance, took a deep breath, and approached. "Professor Kim," she interjected politely, waiting for a pause. "Excuse me, I was rereading your seminal 1988 paper on atmospheric modeling last night." His attention shifted to her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "It's truly foundational work. I was wondering, the observational tools were so different back then, much less precise. How did you manage to derive the core parameters so effectively under those constraints? The signal processing challenges must have been immense." A subtle change came over Professor Kim's expression. The defensiveness softened, replaced by a glimmer of pride. He launched into a detailed account of late nights in the lab, battling noisy data from primitive charge-coupled devices, the painstaking process of manual calculations before sophisticated software existed. He spoke of the skepticism he faced initially, the perseverance required. For 10 minutes, he was the hero of his own story, the pioneering scientist battling the odds. Jimin listened intently, nodding, asking clarifying questions about specific techniques he mentioned. The tension between them evaporated, replaced by an almost collegial atmosphere. Encouraged, Jimin saw an opening. "It's fascinating, Professor, and that rigorous foundation makes the small anomalies we see now with superior instruments like the one in Kepler 186f even more intriguing, doesn't it? It hints at new physics you laid the groundwork for." The shift was instantaneous. The warmth vanished, the shield slammed back down. "The foundation remains solid, Dr. Park," he stated coolly. "These so-called anomalies are statistical ghosts. My model remains the standard for a reason." He turned back to the younger faculty member, dismissing her once more. Jimin walked away, a mix of disappointment and grudging acknowledgement swirling within her. Strategy 1 had worked, temporarily. It had diffused the immediate hostility, made him receptive for a moment, but it hadn't opened his mind. It was a tool for managing interaction, not for changing conviction. A partial success, perhaps, but her data remained unacknowledged, her path forward still blocked. The partial success of the first strategy, however limited, gave Jimin a sliver of hope. It wasn't about overwhelming him with logic, it was about navigating his defenses. She turned her thoughts to strategy 2, ask unexpected questions. The goal wasn't to trap him, but to gently probe the boundaries of his certainty, perhaps making him question his own assumptions without feeling directly attacked. What question could possibly make Professor Kim pause, make him consider the limits of his own cherished model? It needed to be respectful, genuinely curious in tone, but aimed at the core of his resistance, his unwillingness to consider contradictory evidence. The opportunity arose during a routine project update meeting. Jimin needed Professor Kim's signature to allocate a small portion of grant funding towards securing additional observation time on a more powerful telescope, specifically to confirm the Kepler 186f anomaly. He was stalling, predictably. "Dr. Park, I fail to see the justification for this expenditure," he stated, tapping his pen on the form. "Your time is better spent refining analyses within the existing validated framework. Pursuing these marginal signals is inefficient." Jimin kept her hands clasped loosely in her lap, maintaining eye contact. She deliberately softened her voice. "I understand your concern for efficiency, Professor. You believe the current model fully explains the observational data." He nodded curtly. "I'm genuinely curious," she continued, leaning forward slightly, adopting an air of intellectual inquiry. "From your deep experience with model building, what specific, hypothetical observational result would convince you that the standard model might need significant refinement? Is there a threshold, a particular type of signature that would make you reconsider its universality?" There was a distinct pause, longer than usual. Professor Kim's hand stopped tapping the pen, his brow furrowed, not in anger this time, but in thought, or perhaps confusion. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Jimin held her breath, careful not to betray her anticipation. Finally he spoke, but his voice lacked its usual booming certainty. That's a rather abstract question, Dr. Park. The model is sound. It's based on fundamental physics." He was deflecting, but the deflection itself was revealing. He couldn't or wouldn't define the conditions under which his own theory could be falsified. It suggested his conviction wasn't based on a continuous evaluation of evidence, but on a fixed belief. "Of course, Professor," Jimin replied smoothly, not pushing the point. "Thank you for clarifying." He still looked slightly unsettled as he finally, reluctantly, scribbled his signature on the funding allocation form. He waved her away, clearly wanting the conversation over. Jimin left the office with the signed form, but more importantly, with a clearer understanding of the man she was dealing with. Strategy 2 hadn't converted him, hadn't made him embrace her data, but it had momentarily bypassed his reflexive defenses, revealing the lack of deep consideration behind his rigid stance. It hadn't won the war, but it had subtly shifted the dynamics of their interaction. She felt less like a powerless student and more like an observer, analyzing not just exoplanet atmospheres, but the complex, often irrational, atmosphere of human ego. The additional observation time proved crucial. Data streamed in from the larger telescope, confirming the anomaly with stunning clarity. It wasn't just noise, it was a complex, structured signal, potentially indicating biosignatures. The implications were staggering. Jimin felt a thrill course through her, the pure joy of discovery momentarily eclipsing the political hurdles. But the hurdles remained. A major astrophysics conference in Busan was approaching, the deadline for abstract submission just weeks away. This was the platform to present her findings, to bypass the internal bottleneck if necessary. But presenting work without the explicit, enthusiastic backing of one's supervisor, especially one as influential as Professor Kim, was a risky move in the hierarchical world of Korean academia. She knew he would likely try to block it or downplay its significance. She couldn't rely on changing his mind anymore. She had to prepare for Strategy 3, acknowledge his position, but firmly state her own intention. Boundary setting. The decision to proceed felt like stepping off a ledge. Jimin knew the potential fallout, strained relationships within the department, whispers about her being difficult or overly ambitious, Professor Kim potentially using his influence to hinder her future prospects. Yet the data demanded to be heard. It was bigger than her fear, bigger than Professor Kim's ego. She spent hours crafting her conference abstract, ensuring every claim was meticulously supported by the new, high-resolution data. She submitted it just before the deadline, her heart pounding. There was no turning back now. Then came the preparation for the presentation itself. She rehearsed it endlessly, not just the scientific content, but the potential confrontation. She visualized Professor Kim in the audience, imagined his objections, his dismissive tone, and she practiced her response, the core of Strategy 3. She stood in front of the mirror in her small office cell, the glittering night view of Seoul behind her reflection, a stark contrast to the internal turmoil. Professor Kim raises valid points based on the established framework, she recited, trying to keep her voice steady. 충분히 그렇게 생각할 수 있죠. You can certainly think that way. That's a valid perspective to hold. Deep breath. However, the consistency and strength of this new dataset warrant the further analysis I am proposing, and I will proceed with it. Saying it aloud, even to her reflection, felt both terrifying and empowering. It was polite, respectful even, acknowledging his status and perspective. But it was also unambiguous. It closed the door on further debate about her intention to proceed, shifting the focus back to the merits of her work. She practiced variations, ensuring the tone was calm, firm, and professional, devoid of anger or defensiveness. She wasn't asking for permission. She was stating her course. She also confided in Soo-yeon about her plan, who listened with a mixture of concern and admiration. It's risky, Jimin, Soo-yeon warned, but maybe necessary. Just be prepared. Document everything. The abstract was accepted. A wave of relief washed over Jimin, quickly followed by renewed anxiety. It was real now. She booked her KTX train ticket to Busan. The conference took place in a sleek convention center overlooking Hyundai Beach. The air buzzed with intellectual energy, a global gathering of minds focused on unraveling the mysteries of the cosmos. Jimin found her session room, her hands clammy as she set up her laptop. She scanned the audience. And there he was, Professor Kim, seated in the third row, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but radiating disapproval. Her stomach plummeted. He had come all the way to Busan. This wasn't just passive resistance anymore. It felt like active opposition. Her presentation slot arrived. Taking another deep, centering breath, Jimin walked to the podium. She began, her voice slightly shaky at first, but gaining strength as she focused on the data, on the story the photons had traveled light years to tell. She presented the Kepler findings, then the stunning confirmation from the larger telescope, the graphs sharp and clear on the large screen. She outlined her analysis, her interpretation, the potential implications. A murmur went through the audience, a mix of skepticism and excitement. Then came the Q&A. As expected, Professor Kim's hand shot up first. He stood, commanding attention. "Dr. Park," his voice boomed, carrying clearly through the room, "while your diligence is noted, you seem to overlook decades of established atmospheric physics. Your interpretation of these faint signals is premature and relies on speculative assumptions. The standard model, my model, remains the most parsimonious explanation." He wasn't asking a question, he was delivering a verdict, attempting to shut down the discussion before it began, using his authority to frame her work as flawed. This was the moment. The air crackled with tension. All eyes were on Jimin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her practice kicked in. She met his gaze directly, kept her voice calm and measured. "Thank you, Professor Kim," she began, acknowledging his status. Professor Kim raises valid points based on the established framework, which has served as an essential foundation for decades. A slight pause, letting the acknowledgement register. "충분히 그렇게 생각할 수 있죠." The Korean phrase felt solid, grounding. "However," she continued, turning slightly to address the wider audience now, shifting the focus away from a personal duel, "the data I've presented today, particularly the high-resolution spectra confirming the anomaly's structure and persistence, is consistent and compelling. It strongly suggests parameters beyond the standard model. This warrants the new line of inquiry I am pursuing, and I will be proceeding with the detailed analysis of potential complex molecules." She then smoothly transitioned. Regarding the specific point about parsimony, the statistical significance here, she clicked back to a relevant slide, actually suggests that not accounting for this signature requires more complex explanations, like multiple unknown instrumental effects perfectly mimicking this specific spectral pattern across different platforms. She continued, addressing the scientific substance of his implied criticism without getting drawn back into a battle over her right to investigate. She then smoothly transitioned. Regarding the specific point about parsimony, the statistical significance here, she clicked back to a relevant slide, actually suggests that not accounting for this signature requires more complex explanations, like multiple unknowns. There was a beat of silence after Jimin finished speaking. Professor Kim remained standing, his face tight with displeasure, but he seemed momentarily thrown off by her refusal to engage in a direct confrontation about authority. Before he could formulate a rebuttal, another hand shot up, a respected astrophysicist from Germany. "Dr. Park, fascinating data. Could you elaborate on the potential energy source required to sustain such complex molecules at the observed altitude?" More questions followed, technical, specific, genuinely curious. The focus shifted decisively from Professor Kim's pronouncement to the scientific merit of Jimin's findings. She answered confidently, her deep knowledge of the data evident. Professor Kim eventually sat down, his arms still crossed, a thunderous expression fixed on his face, but effectively sidelined. He had tried to control the narrative, and Jimin, using the strategy she'd practiced, had calmly, firmly refused to let him. She hadn't attacked him. She had simply asserted her scientific position and redirected the conversation back to the evidence. After the session ended, several researchers approached Jimin, expressing interest, offering suggestions, asking for preprints. The German professor complimented her, very clear handling of a challenging line of questioning. Jimin felt a profound sense of relief flood through her, so potent it almost made her knees weak. She hadn't won an argument with Professor Kim. She had successfully navigated his opposition in a public forum and protected the integrity of her research. She saw Soo-yeon near the back of the room, offering a small, discreet thumbs up and a knowing smile. Professor Kim left the conference center shortly after, without speaking to Jimin. His disapproval was palpable. But his power to unilaterally dismiss her work in that setting had been neutralized. Jimin knew things might still be tense back at Senyu, that he might hold a grudge. But something fundamental had shifted within her. The gnawing anxiety was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-won confidence. She had faced the conflict she dreaded, not by resorting to his tactics or her old habits of frustrated logic, but by employing a strategy that respected boundaries, his stated perspective and her own determination. The train ride back from Busan to Seoul felt different. Staring out at the rapidly passing Korean countryside, Jimin reflected. The core message of the communication advice she'd found wasn't just about managing difficult people, it was about managing herself. It was about recognizing which battles were worth fighting and how to fight them without sacrificing her own peace or objectives. It was about understanding that true strength didn't always lie in confrontation or logical victory, but sometimes in strategic withdrawal from pointless arguments, in clear boundary setting, and in preserving one's energy for what truly mattered. Professor Kim might never change. He might always believe his model was supreme, his authority unquestionable. But Jimin now knew she didn't need his validation to pursue the truth the data revealed. She had found a way to move forward, respecting the hierarchy where necessary, but not being imprisoned by it. Back in her shared office at SNU, the atmosphere with Professor Kim was cool, professionally distant. He avoided discussing her research directly, focusing instead on administrative tasks or other projects. But he didn't actively obstruct her analysis anymore. Perhaps he realized others were now watching, or perhaps he simply didn't know how to engage now that his usual tactics had proven ineffective against her calm boundary setting. Jimin didn't push for reconciliation. She focused on her work. She collaborated via email with some of the researchers she met in Busan, refining her analysis, preparing a manuscript. She felt a sense of liberation. The constant tension that had plagued her for months had eased, replaced by the familiar, focused hum of scientific inquiry. One afternoon, looking up from her screen filled with complex molecular simulations, she saw Soo-yeon pausing by her doorway. "Heard the manuscript draft is looking good," Soo-yeon said softly, a smile in her eyes. Jimin smiled back, a genuine, relaxed smile. "It's getting there. Still a lot to do, but it feels right." "You handled the situation well, Jimin-ah?" Soo-yeon said. "Not easy." "No," Jimin agreed, glancing towards Professor Kim's closed office door down the hall. "It wasn't, but it was necessary." She turned back to her screen, where the simulated atmosphere of a distant world glowed. She thought about the vast, quiet emptiness of space, governed by immutable laws of physics, and the messy, illogical, emotional complexities of human interaction. Navigating both required different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of strength, and she was finally learning how to wield both. The true victory wasn't changing Professor Kim's mind, it was finding her own voice, protecting her work, and reclaiming her peace in the challenging landscape of academia. She had learned that sometimes the wisest step isn't meeting force with force, but stepping back, acknowledging the other's reality without accepting it as her own, and clearly stating, "This is how I will proceed." It was a lesson learned not just for dealing with difficult professors, but for navigating the intricate dance of human relationships everywhere. Jimin continued her work with renewed determination. The manuscript detailing her findings on Kepler 186f took shape, each paragraph, each figure meticulously crafted. She sent drafts to the collaborators she'd connected with at the Busan conference, incorporating their feedback. The process felt different now, open, collaborative, focused purely on the science. Professor Kim remained a distant figure. He would nod curtly in the hallways, make minimal comments in department meetings, but the direct confrontations ceased. It wasn't warmth, but it was a workable truce born from her refusal to engage in his preferred style of conflict. There were still moments of doubt, whispers of apprehension about the eventual submission process. Would Professor Kim use his influence behind the scenes to cast doubt on her work during peer review? It was a possibility she couldn't discount. So-yeon had subtly advised her to choose her target journal carefully, perhaps one where the editor-in-chief was known for impartiality, or where her international collaborators held some sway. Jimin spent hours researching journal impact factors, editorial boards, and recent publications in related fields. This, too, she realized, was part of the strategic navigation required, extending beyond direct communication into the political landscape of scientific publishing. One day, while analyzing a new dataset from a different exoplanet system, she found herself instinctively looking for patterns that fit Professor Kim's model first, a subconscious habit born from months of trying to anticipate his objections. She caught herself, a small smile playing on her lips. The old anxiety, the need to preemptively defend against his worldview, was fading. She could now look at the data objectively, allowing it to lead her wherever it pointed, without the filter of his expected disapproval. This internal shift felt almost as significant as the external change in their interactions. She was no longer framing her research in opposition to him, but simply pursuing the questions the universe presented. The process of applying the communication strategies hadn't been a magic wand. It had required conscious effort, emotional regulation, and the courage to deviate from her ingrained, logic-driven approach. There were times, especially early on, when she had almost slipped back into arguing, into letting frustration dictate her responses. Recalling the feeling of Professor Kim being momentarily stumped by her unexpected question, or the quiet authority she felt during the conference Q&A, helped reinforce the effectiveness of the new approach. It wasn't about being passive. It was about being strategically assertive, choosing the right tools for the specific interpersonal challenge. She realized the advice she'd found online, the core message echoing Suyun's subtle hints, wasn't just about handling stubborn people. It was about recognizing that communication is rarely just about the logical exchange of information. It's intertwined with ego, insecurity, history, and emotion. Acknowledging the other person's reality, even if you fundamentally disagree with it, 충분히 그렇게 생각할 수 있죠, wasn't an act of concession, but a way of lowering defenses, creating space for a different kind of conversation, one where boundaries could be clearly stated without necessarily escalating conflict. Acknowledging the other person's reality, even if you fundamentally disagree with it, 충분히 그렇게 생각할 수 있죠, wasn't an act of concession, but a way of lowering defenses, creating space for a different kind of aid. It allowed her to preserve her energy, avoiding the draining, unproductive arguments that had consumed her previously. That saved energy was now channeled back into her research, where it belonged. The final manuscript was ready. Jimin took a deep breath and attached it to an email addressed to Professor Kim. Not for his approval this time, but for his information, as was protocol for researchers in his group. The subject line was simple: manuscript draft for submission, title. The email body was brief and professional, stating her intention to submit to the Astrophysical Journal letters the following week. She didn't ask for his blessing or fear his critique in the same way anymore. She hit send, a sense of calm finality settling over her. Whatever happened next, she had navigated the most difficult part of the journey, the interpersonal conflict, and emerged stronger, more self-aware, and ready for the next challenge. Her focus was clear: the shimmering data, the distant worlds, and the quiet satisfaction of pursuing scientific truth on her own terms. Professor Kim's response, when it came a day later, was brief and non-committal. Noted, Dr. Park, ensure all departmental protocols are followed. There was no critique, no praise, no further attempt to dissuade her. It was perhaps the best outcome she could have realistically hoped for, not enthusiastic support, but a lack of active resistance. It felt like a quiet acknowledgement that she had established her autonomy regarding this line of research. Jimin submitted the manuscript. The peer review process began its slow, meticulous grind. Waiting felt different this time. Previously, the waiting would have been filled with anxiety about Professor Kim's potential interference. Now, while the inherent uncertainty of peer review remained, she felt a sense of peace. She had done her part, presented her best work, and navigated the human element as skillfully as she could. The outcome was now in the hands of the scientific community. During this waiting period, Jimin found herself engaging differently in departmental seminars and discussions. She listened more actively, not just to the scientific content, but to the underlying dynamics, the subtle cues of ego and insecurity in others' arguments. She found herself less likely to jump into purely logical debates, more inclined to ask clarifying questions or acknowledge differing perspectives before stating her own view. It wasn't about avoiding disagreement, but about making disagreements more productive, less adversarial. She noticed Soo-yeon observing her occasionally, a slight approving nod indicating she saw the change. The relationship with Soo-yeon deepened into a genuine friendship, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. They often shared quick coffees or lunches, discussing not just research, but the challenges of navigating academia, the subtle politics, the work-life balance struggles in the demanding environment of Seoul. Jimin realized the importance of having allies, people who understood the specific pressures and could offer pragmatic advice or simply a sympathetic ear. The original advice about curating supportive relationships resonated strongly. Distancing oneself from draining interactions wasn't just about avoiding negativity, it was about creating space for positive connections to flourish. Months later, the email arrived. Astrophysical Journal letters, decision on manuscript ID. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened it. Accepted with minor revisions. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over her, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. Despite the resistance, despite the difficult personality, despite the hierarchical hurdles, her work, her data, her interpretation would be published. She allowed herself a moment of celebration, leaning back in her chair, looking out the window at the familiar Seoul skyline. The city lights seemed to twinkle with a little more brilliance tonight. She thought back to the initial frustration, the feeling of being trapped, the desperate search for a different way. The journey had been about more than just exoplanet atmospheres. It had been about finding her own voice, learning the subtle art of asserting herself without aggression, and understanding that sometimes the greatest power lies not in winning an argument, but in controlling one's own response and protecting one's own peace. It had been about finding her own voice, learning the subtle art of asserting herself without aggression, and understanding that sometimes the greatest power lies not in winning an argument, but in Naomid. Professor Kim might never acknowledge the significance of her findings, might always cling to his established models. But in the vast, indifferent universe and in the small, significant world of her own life, Jimin had found her way forward. She had learned to navigate the gravitational pull of difficult personalities and set her own course towards the stars.